Tonight is the story of Moses and the burning bush. So as Pastor has done in some of his inductive Bible studies, we want to set the picture. You can't really understand what's happening here until you get the whole picture of Moses. Everybody knows, little baby put in the basket, Pharaoh's daughter finds him, grows up, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot in that story that set the stage for this that you need to realize in order to understand what Moses has been through at God's behest and what God was trying to set up to have him do. Now, overall, the sons of Israel have been in Egypt for about 400 years. Remember that they went down there to escape famine under the protection of Joseph, who was working for one of the pharaohs. Now, the fact that that pharaoh had Joseph working for him is not as unusual as you might think it would be. At about that time in history, there was an invasion in Egypt of a group called the Hyksos, who were actually related to the Jews. They were a Semitic group. As in fact, some interpreters would tell you that the whole story of the Israelites moving down there with the 12 tribes and all that sort of stuff, the sons of Israel moving there, was made up to describe the Hyksos invasion of Egypt, since they were Semitic peoples. I'm not even going there, not worth it. Nonetheless, Exodus is a book. The name Exodus is actually adapted from the Latin and English. The name of the book in Hebrew is Ve'ela Shemoth, which means these are the names of, which is also the exact phrase that's in Genesis 46:8. Most biblical scholars consider Genesis and Exodus to actually be part of one big book. It's broken apart arbitrarily, was done so probably by people who were assembling things so they can be found. Remember, the chapter and verses are not inspired. That was done by a monk in the 15th or 16th century. Nonetheless, Exodus and Genesis are sort of one long story. The Hebrews are in Egypt. Some people think about 400 years, others say more than 200 years. The chronology is a little hard to come up with. In Kings, it says that the Exodus was 480 years before the 4th year of the reign of Solomon. So that would have been roughly 996 BC, which would have put the Exodus at about 1446 BC, roughly. The traditional view is that it was under the 18th dynasty of the pharaohs. And there's actually a reason I'm getting to all this. The 18th dynasty, most people think that Thutmose the third was the pharaoh of the oppression, and that his son, Amenhotep II, was the pharaoh of the Exodus. But if you look, if you look at Genesis 1:11, you see that they talk about I'll just read it. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. Now, other people say, why would Amenhotep II build a city, or Thutmose II build a city and name it Ramses, because Ramses hasn't been Pharaoh yet? So there is an opposing group that thinks Seti I was the Pharaoh of the oppression and that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Archaeologically, if you look at cities in Canaan, you'll find that in the 13th century BC, there's a lot of evidence that many of those Canaanite cities were destroyed and rebuilt, which actually fits in with the invasion of the Israelites under Joshua. And that would have put the Exodus under Seti I and Ramses II at about 1290 BC. Does it matter? Well, a little, if you kind of want to put everything together. But one of the things you need to understand about Moses before you read the burning bush story, surprisingly enough, is in the New Testament. Look at Acts 7. And I used to jump around and have all these marked, and everybody fussed that they couldn't get to everything fast enough, so I stopped marking them, so I'm looking it up just like you are. So Acts 7, 29 through 30, this is Stephen's defense before the high priest. Stephen was he would have been a Greek Jew who was one of the first deacons. Remember, he is stoned. But he tells the story of Moses. Now, why would that have been accurate? Stephen would have been trained as a Jew. And it's fascinating to see. I used to sit and talk with one of my Jewish buddies in the surgeon's lounge all the time. He was a neurosurgeon, and we did cases together all the time. And there's all sorts of stuff I learned about how the Jews believe things and what different groups believe. It's just fascinating to talk to him. One of the things, I'll just throw this for free. The tablets that Moses came down with the Ten Commandments on, under Jewish tradition, was actually a giant square cube that was an emerald. It was a jewel. It had two of them. And the commandments were inscribed in 3 dimensions within the jewel, such that if you looked at it from any angle, you saw all 5. And that was what Moses broke. And that's why he had to make new ones on stone tablets. Anyway, Jewish tradition. Thought it's an interesting story. Does it mean anything? No. But Stephen would have been taught all this stuff, so he's been taught some stuff about Moses that's not in Exodus. So, Acts 7:29. Oh, actually, we'll start before that. Look at verse 20. It was at that time that Moses was born and was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. Now remember the situation under which he was born. The Jews are breeding too fast. They're getting to be more than Egyptians. So Pharaoh initially tells the midwives of the Jewish nation that if you deliver a girl, great. If you deliver a boy, strangle him. And the midwives refuse. And when Pharaoh calls them in, they say, well, the Jewish women are so healthy, they just give birth so fast, we don't even have time to get there. So we don't have time to strangle together. So then he said, well, all Jewish male babies have to be thrown into the Nile, given to the Nile. So when Moses is born, and this is back in Exodus, he's actually kept in their house for 3 months. How many of you have had a 3-month-old baby that you could keep quiet enough that the people who lived without a window and a door right over there wouldn't know he was in there? That's what they're facing. So they were able to keep him quiet for 3 months. Remember, the family was told, you have to throw him in the Nile. It didn't say you couldn't throw him in the Nile in a basket. It just said you had to throw him in a Nile. So they took Moses, put him in the basket, floated him in the reeds of the Nile. And Pharaoh's daughter comes down, because that's where she comes to bathe. It was at that time, after he had been set aside, outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians and was a man of power in words and deeds. Much of the learning of the Egyptians had to do with magic, with the gods, with the occult, with astrology. Moses has learned all of this as part of the royal family. When Moses goes back later in Exodus and the plagues occur, remember, many of the plagues the Egyptian magicians were able to duplicate until God really brought the hammer, and then suddenly they couldn't duplicate them. But the Egyptians were big into magic. He's learned all of this, and he is a man of power in words and deeds. The power in words thing implies that he had learned Egyptian magic, which is actually one of the reasons I believe Pharaoh didn't believe him initially. Moses was, and when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered into his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. Moses knows he's a Jew. Pharaoh's family knows he's a Jew. But Pharaoh's daughter has raised him, and he's special. So they know he's a Jew, but they don't treat him like one. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So initially, Moses kind of steps in and says, you know, I'm going to be your good guy. I'm going to get you out of this. He was oppressing you, and I killed him. But recall that what the Jews say to him then is, what, are you going to treat me like you did that Egyptian yesterday? You kill me too? One cannot be a prophet or a deliverer unless called by God to do so. And God has not called Moses yet. And that is actually brought out in the 3rd chapter. We'll get to that. But Moses jumped the gun. We do things in God's own time. I was ready to move back here 3 years after I went to Mississippi. My house was on the market for almost 2. I wanted out of there. And then when it was time, boom, it happened within 3 weeks. Household job changed everything. It happens in God's time. Now Moses is 40. Keep this in mind. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace. Men, you are brethren. Why do you injure one another? But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over this? Now that's sort of funny, because at this point he's not. But in another 40 years, he will be the ruler and judge over the entire Israeli nation. You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday. And at this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons. And look at 30. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning thorn bush. He's 80 when this happens. Now, I realize we're used to the folks in the Bible living longer than we do, and indeed that was the case. But 80 is still 80. So let's look at what's happened to Moses. Moses, you know, kills the guy, steps in. Now, had he been truly royal family, he could have killed that taskmaster. So what? Wouldn't have been a big deal. An Egyptian prince could kill anybody he wanted to kill who was not another Egyptian prince. But they knew he was a Jew. And he was defending a Jew when he killed the Egyptian taskmaster. So he runs. And he runs to Midian. Now, don't have a slide, probably should have gotten one. But you know the big square that is Saudi Arabia. Midian is on the western side of the Red Sea. You know, if Egypt's here, you go up to the Promised Land, you go over here to Midian. And Midian is where Sinai is. So in his running, what has Moses done? He's traced the path that the Israelites are going to follow. He knows. Now, God eventually leads them with a cloud of smoke and fire, but Moses knows where to go. Moses knows where the springs are, because that's the way Moses ran when he ran to Midian. Now, the Midianites, again, if you don't know, or to just kind of remind everyone, the Midianites are also descended from Abraham. Remember, after Sarah died, Abraham remarried. I think he was 126, anyway. He remarries, and Midian is one of the sons of his new wife after Sarah. So they're actually related to the Hebrews, and they worship, most people think, the same God. So he flees to Midian. You probably know the story of him protecting Jethro, who will be his father-in-law's daughter. Jethro is a priest of the Lord. He ends up marrying his daughter, having 2 children, and he's shepherding his father-in-law's sheep when he's 80. Prince of Egypt, shepherd in the wilderness, only job you can get is with your father-in-law when you're 80. Slightly different point in life. He's with the Midianites. He's in the southeastern Sinai. Look at 2:23. Now it came about in the course of those long many days that the king of Egypt died. Now that would have been Thutmose III. And Thutmose had a very long reign, thus the term, the long course of days. I want you to think about that name. The Pharaoh's name had been Thutmose, M-O-S-E. Moses' name is M-O-S-E-S. Moses is both an Egyptian and a Hebrew name. In Egyptian, it means born of. Thutmose, Thut was an Egyptian god. Thutmose was born of Thut. Ramses, M-S-E-S, that's the same root word as Moses. Born of or son of Ra, who was the sun god. Moses has the name of an Egyptian pharaoh. In Hebrew, it means drawn out of. He was taken out of the waters of the Nile. So he actually has both an Egyptian and a Hebrew name that fits in with the names of the pharaohs. So Thutmose died. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. Now, guess what? We're only 20 minutes into it. We're in chapter 3. We got there. Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now the wilderness was the area west of the Red Sea, and on the western slope of that mountain range. Now it says Mount Horeb. Stephen said it was on Sinai. So some people believe Horeb and Sinai are the same mountain. So I do. Tradition says that Mount Horeb is a mountain called Ras Asafsa, which is about 6,500 feet tall, and next to it is Jubal Musa, which is the traditional site of Mount Sinai, that there were 2 mountains here, and one was Sinai and one was Horeb. I think it's the same name for the same mountain. But stop and think about this. He's wandered for 40 years and has come to Sinai. He has taken the same course Israel is going to take. He is an archetype. He is a precursor of what this entire nation is going to do under his leadership. And he is on Mount Sinai, I believe. I don't believe it's a different one. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him. Now, most people here know from sermons, teaching, etc., that when you see the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, that is referring to a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. No man has seen the Father. When you see the angel of the Lord here, that is Jesus before he comes. So, the angel of the Lord appears to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. I find these two verses absolutely hilarious. Stop and think about it for a minute. 80-year-old guy walking along with the sheep. The bush is on fire. Who set that bush on fire? It's not burning. I got to go look at this. So that's exactly what happened. I must turn aside. The bush was over here. He's got his sheep, and he goes, whoa, look. I got to go see why that bush is burning. He's out in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody else there. Who set the bush on fire? How come it's burning? How come it's not burning? Wow, that's cool. Let's go look at that. So he walks over to check out the bush. And the Lord saw that he turned aside to look. Now, stop and think about that. God's watching him. And God sees him turn and come toward the bush. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. I'm here. That's exactly, he hears his voice coming out of the bush. Okay, I'm here. Then he said, do not come near me. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Now, put yourself in Moses' shoes, no pun intended, shoes here. He has, he's seen this, but he hears this voice, and the voice says, take your sandals off. Okay. Might as well. What have I got to lose? So he takes his sandals off. Notice that it says the ground is holy. One thing to just sort of interject here. We have this tendency in Christianity to view holy as some type of behavior. But throughout the Old Testament, that's not what holy means. Holy means set aside for the use of God. How can ground behave? There was holy oil. There was holy incense. Why? You couldn't use the incense anywhere but the temple. You couldn't use the oil anywhere but the temple. It was set aside for the use of God. Be ye holy, for I am holy means be ye set aside for the use of God. We are here for what he wants us to do in his own time. And if you pay attention throughout the Old Testament, when it refers to things that are holy, it is not talking about haloed behavior. It is talking about being set aside for the use of God. That's what it means. He said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Then Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. You ever notice in the Old Testament, throughout the Old Testament, what is the reaction of virtually everybody to the angel of the Lord or to an angel? They always hide their face and fall to the ground in fear because I'm not supposed to see this. Pardon me. It's been a long week, dry air in Minnesota. The reaction of everyone who sees God is overwhelming humility and awe. And it is for Moses too. Now, it's fascinating to see how he behaves here. He talks about he hides his face. Look at Exodus 33:18. You want to know how Moses changes through the years? Well, verse 17. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. Then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. His initial reaction when he saw the glory of God burning in the bush was to fall and hide his face. After his 40 years of service, his response is, show me your glory. And recall, God only allows him to see his back. He speaks to him face to face, but when his glory passes by, he's only allowed to see his back. So, he falls. Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people in Egypt, and have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. I just want to talk about that phrase for a minute. We've all heard that phrase all of our lives. A land flowing with milk and honey. Now, I remember hearing that when I was growing up. As long as I can remember, I have not liked the taste of milk. Just didn't drink it. Never have. Wasn't that crazy about honey most of the time either. And I used to think, land flowing with milk and honey, that doesn't sound that great, does it? Here's the deal. You have to understand from this particular time what that phrase means. How do you get milk? You pasture animals on green grass and give them plenty of pasturage and plenty of water, and they will give you milk. How do you get honey? Wildflowers and crops and bees. The only way to get a lot of milk and a lot of honey is to have a land that is full of fertility and grass and water and flowers and growing things. So this is a way to say that this land is overflowing in abundance. That there's so much grass it produces more milk than you can handle, kind of like Wisconsin. And there's so many wildflowers and things growing that there's honey everywhere. So that's what that phrase means. The land flowing with milk and honey has to do with, and if you've ever been to Israel, does it look like green grass and wildflowers? Not unless there's a irrigation. It depends on where you're at. Back then it all was. Talk about climate change. But it was a wonderful place to be. Now, there is a book by Andrew Cahill called The Gift of the Jews. And this verse is kind of a beginning introduction to what theologians look at and what historians look at, is how Jews changed the way human beings looked at God. Before the Exodus, gods were looked at as local phenomenon. You got your Canaanite gods, you got your Egyptian gods, you got your Babylonian gods. Everybody's got their own territory. Your Greek gods, your Roman gods, but they didn't know about them. The gift of the Jews is the very idea that a God is universal. The Lord, as he presents himself and as he reveals himself to the Jews, reveals himself through Moses and to the Jews as a universal God. He is everywhere, and that's going to be tied into what we're going to see about his name in just a minute. He is everywhere. That doesn't fit with Egyptian theology. When he says, let my people go, they don't care. He's the God from up there. We have our own down here. Our own will take care of him. Remember, I believe it was Elijah who healed the leper, who asks for a wagon of dirt to take back with him to Babylon so that he can worship God. Because God is only on his property, only in his region, according to their theology. The gift of the Jews, what we're beginning to see the revelation of, is that God is everywhere, that his power is universal. And it is this burning bush incident that introduces that possibility to a man who 40 years ago was being taught Egyptian theology and magic and culture. And now he's had 40 years to sit in the wilderness and think about things. We have this vision of the Old Testament characters kind of constantly talking to God. First thing Moses has heard in 80 years. If you go through and look at most of the prophets, God appears to them max 5, maybe 6 times. He appears to Moses more than he does to anybody later. But he's 80 before he ever gets a message from the Lord. Now behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore, come now, I will send you to Pharaoh, your uncle. Pharaoh's daughter raised him. That would have been his uncle. And he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Now that's an interesting sign, because the sign's going to happen after you do it. Most of the time when you get a sign, it's okay, give me a sign and I'll do that. No, this is, you show faith, you step out, you do it in God's time, then I will give you the sign. And this is another verse that makes me think he's on Sinai, because it said, you will come back and worship me on this mountain. So what's the first thing Moses said to God? But hang on. Skip to verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? So it's interesting. Moses asked God in this chapter 2 questions. The first thing he asked him is, who am I? The second thing he asked him is, who are you? Same question. And he offers Moses the sign. And then Moses said to God, behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What am I to say to them? Now that's an interesting question. In Egyptian lore, and in fact in almost all magical lore around the world, you gain power over something by knowing its name. Magicians would claim to summon things by calling their name. This is not a man who is versed in Hebrew theology. He's asking an Egyptian question. So what name would I use if I wanted to call you up? This is actually an attempt by Moses to kind of get a handle on things. Remember, he's been trained that you call gods up by knowing their name. So the first thing he says is, who am I? The second thing he says is, well, who are you? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Why YHWH in Hebrew. Now, somehow they got transliterated in modern English to Jehovah, which really doesn't match and is a misspelling. But in Hebrew, it is the verb that encompasses being. I am. I am now. I am then. I am the future. God stands outside of time. What God is teaching Moses here is, number one, I am everywhere, and number two, I am every when. He is present outside of time. I love that whole concept, and it's a hard one to wrap a human mind around, that God actually sees all of time right now. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham is happening to God right now. Moses is happening to God right now. Jesus is happening right now. We are happening right now. He sees it all. Tied in understanding this, interestingly enough, is the eternal security of the believer. If God sees your entire life right now, how in the world would He save you now, but decide because of what you did then, you weren't going to be saved then? He knows and is experiencing everything you will ever do at the moment you come to Him for salvation. So how could anyone ever be saved and then lost? To believe that can happen is to denigrate the power and image of God. And to believe that when He saved you, He didn't know how bad you could really be. And He didn't know this would happen. No, He did. And He saved you. There is no saved then lost. God is every when. His name is I Am. He is there now. He is there then. There is no being lost after you have been saved. Because that says God doesn't know what my future life will be like. So, YHWH, I am. Oddly enough about that Hebrew verse, when God says it, it means I am. When it's pronounced by someone else, it means He is. One of the things that I find that's fascinating, tied up in that particular name, and let me get the scripture reference here. Look at John 8, 58 and 59. You have probably heard many people who say, because I heard this when I was growing up, well, Jesus never really claimed to be God. Well, that's only if you're not a Jew. Look at John 8, 58 and 59. Well, let's start at 57. So the Jews said to Him, you are not yet 50 years old. Have you seen Abraham? Jesus therefore said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Therefore they picked up stones to throw at Him, but He hid Himself and went out of the temple. To a Jew, Jesus laid claim to the Godhood with that statement. He used the name of God to refer to Himself. You cannot say Jesus never claimed to be God. He did. He did right there to any Jew. And the other Jews understand it so well, they decided to stone Him right then and there. I love the fact that He just disappeared and walked out of the temple. I suspect that gave some of the Pharisees second thoughts about whether they really wanted to stone Him or not. God furthermore said to Moses, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, This is my memorial name to all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel. Now in Hebrew, that word elders right there is kind of cool, because in this room there's only 3 people who could be elders. Because in Hebrew it means bearded ones. So, we got 1, 2, 3. I don't know if you'd count this or not. So you got bearded ones. Why did that matter? In a time in history when average lifespan was about 35 to 37, you had to be pretty wise to get to be old enough to grow a white beard. It's, how they picked the kings in Hawaii? You've probably seen pictures of King Kamehameha and others, big guys. When the old king died in the tribes of Hawaii, they weighed everybody, and the heaviest guy became king. And they did that figuring that anybody who was smart enough to get that much food is smart enough to run this tribe. That really is how the Hawaiians pick their kings. You're smart enough to get that much food, he's got something going. I don't know what it is, but let's put him in charge, because maybe he can get something for the rest of us. It's the same thing with the elders. You manage to live that long, there's got to be some wisdom there. And that's why the elders ran the tribes. It was true in Egypt, it was true in Israel, it was true in Midian, it was true among the Canaanites. The elders, the older people, the bearded ones, would sit next to the city gates and make the decisions for the entire tribe. So I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. I'm not going to read all those anymore. That's there again, land flowing with milk and honey. Now 18 through 20 is an interesting little stretch, because he tells, and I struggle with this. Pastor, you may have an answer to this. You read these 3 verses, it sounds like God's telling Moses to lie to Pharaoh. They will pay heed to what you say. The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, so now please let us go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. But I know the king of Egypt will not permit you to go except under compulsion. So he's telling him to tell Pharaoh, we only want to go 3 days out into the wilderness to sacrifice. Never mind the 400 miles that we're also going up to Canaan. So is God telling Moses to lie to Pharaoh? We're only going 3 days away. I don't know. It's one of those. That's one of the things that has always puzzled me, because when you read where Moses talks to Pharaoh, many times he said, we need to go 3 days into the wilderness to sacrifice. We can't sacrifice on your land. We need to go into the wilderness just to sacrifice to our God. Now, it's kind of one of those things where everybody knows if you let a slave go 3 days away, he ain't coming back. But that's kind of implied there. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
God is so multi-personality. That's all possible.
Yes.
All of these things are potential and possible thoughts. So it's really difficult for us to put our mind.
Yes, it is. And that's the thing about the plagues in the Exodus. We're commanding him to let you go, but I know he's not going to do it, so I'm going to curse him. And then tell him this one, but he's not going to do that one either, and I'm going to curse him again. And they just keep doing that. One of the verses that I wanted to bring up toward the end is 21 and 22. I will grant this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and the woman who lives in her house articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptian. Look at Genesis 15. This is one of God's promises to Abraham before Israel was even born. Genesis 15:12. No, verse 13. And God said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. But I will judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. I always used to wonder where they came up with all that gold for the tabernacle and all the jewels for the priest's robes. The Egyptians gave them to them. They asked, and God had the Egyptians give them to them. They had been slaves for hundreds of years, and they walked out of Egypt clad in riches that had been given to them by the Egyptians because of God's promise to Abraham before Isaac was ever born. Not only that, but the Egyptians, this became actually law for the Israelites as well. And you don't need to jump back there, but Deuteronomy 15. If your kinsman, Deuteronomy 15:12, a Hebrew man or woman is sold to you, then he shall serve you 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. When you set him free, you shall not send him away empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally from your flock, from your threshing floor, from your wine vat. You shall give to him as the Lord God has blessed you. You remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore I command you this today. So just like they were given gold, jewels, clothes by the Egyptians when they left, they were commanded that when you have a slave and free them, you will give them enough to stay alive, enough to prosper. So, Moses, when you stop and look at him, just like is the case for every prophet, Moses was a man who was designed and prepared for his time and for his task. For 40 years, he learned Egyptian culture, Egyptian language, Egyptian theology. Then he ran. He learned the value of being alone. He spent time with God, and he learned the ways of Sinai and wandering around the desert. He's been all this way before. He knows where it is. God spent 80 years preparing him. He is reluctant. He questions God as to whether he's prepared enough. And he questions God as to whether you have the power to have me do this. Now, the rest of the answer is in chapter 4, which we don't have tonight. But stop and think about Moses. Prepared for his time, prepared for his task, tried to jump the gun 40 years ago. God wasn't ready. And now God is calling him to be Israel's deliverer. Let us each be ready to do what God wants us to do, and just as importantly, when he wants us to do it.
Once again, we want to thank you for tuning into our program. It's been a delight to have you. I trust that you understand a little bit more about what Jesus Christ did for you when he died on the cross. Salvation is not something that you receive because you're born into a family or because you go to church or because you're good. Salvation is a free gift, but that gift has to be received. If you have not received it, we'd like to have you take some time to talk to God and ask Him that He might be your Savior. You understand that you are a sinner, that Jesus Christ died for you, and that you can know that you have eternal life by putting your trust in Christ today.